now, if they want to use social media platforms, have to pay, I think it's 4p every day. So the impact of that is that you find many people have obviously dropped off, so they are not as engaged. So those communities that I was talking about, those engagements that people are having on social media have been disrupted.
This is unattended consequences of attempts.
How after the arrest, he was forced to, give up his passwords, and they had access. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that, in terms of media freedom in Kenya, for example, is that you find that because of most media organizations still depend on government advertising, and therefore they self-censor to make sure that they're in the good books of the government. So what has happened is that usually whenever people people want to leak documents, they've usually used bloggers to leak documents on social media. Now you can imagine the impact of that when the authorities have access to these passwords, and the consequences that come out of access to that information.
So there's issues around the sorts of protections that we rely on as professional journalists to secure our communications being extended to other public interest publishers, if you like, in some context. Okay, Thomas, Hughes from Article 19. How do these factors fit in, I suppose, to the broader trends around freedom of expression and the challenges around the sorts of curtailments that we've been discussing so far? And I suppose if you can particularly link that, given our focus, to the challenges facing media development agencies and donors around the UN sustainability goals.
Sure, and before I get to that, the question, I just want to say that you spoke at the start about expectations for this conference, and I want to make a very clear opening remark that yesterday a group of 33 press freedom and media development organizations met and developed a statement and a call to action for governments, and I think this conference will really stand on the fact, or fall on the fact, as to whether governments adhere to the types of things that civil society are calling for. Our call is very simple. It's got three very easily implementable parts. It's to release all imprisoned journalists, to stop killing, attacking, and denigrating journalists, and to investigate and prosecute all murders for journalists. And I think any government who comes to this conference can certainly live up to those steps. If you're here, then we would ask you to not only speak, but walk the talk, as it were. To answer your question, I think obviously there's a very clear intersection and link between freedom of expression and press freedom more widely, and the Sustainable Development Goals and the eradication of poverty, and also open societies. And where we see that the most marginalised and vulnerable groups don't have access to proper representation or don't have voice, that obviously promotes and fosters often inept or even corrupt forms of governance and service delivery. So I think there's really kind of three intersecting points that we should pay particular attention to. The first is obviously shrinking civic space. I don't think that needs much introduction here, but we do see around the world increasing pressure, particularly on civil society actors. We see governments often targeting dissenting voices. We see them closing down or impeding civic action, particularly around protest. And we see the increasing stigmatization of particular individuals and journalists in this case as well. And that obviously pushes directly back against freedom of expression, but also what we want to achieve through the Sustainable Development Goals. The second one would be pressure on independent media and more broadly intermediaries, if I can use that term. I think
so your platforms, your service providers and so on.
Well, yes, but also individuals who are providing access to information via some of those platforms. And some of these points have been mentioned already, actually, by Mira, but they'll be mentioned, I think, many times during the course of this conference. And they include things like concentration of ownership, which we see in many countries around the world, including the UK.
The decline of pluralism.
Exactly. We see increasing state control over public advertising, and as the traditional advertising models dissipate, public advertising becomes more and more crucial, and therefore governments exert more pressure through public advertising. And we see more issues around misinformation and disinformation. I'm going to avoid the term fake news, but misinformation, disinformation online. And the last very important one, the third point, is failures in accountability and transparency mechanisms broadly around the world. We see the rise and increase of right to information legislation around the world and increasing access to data and the provision of data which is great and very, very welcome. But at the same time, many of the more vulnerable and targeted, marginalized communities around the world find it hard to access that data, to use it, to interpret it, and to ensure that it's put into those accountability loops to ensure that the power holders are held to account. So again, there's much more work that needs to be done there as well.
And Sustainable Development Goal 16 also references specifically, doesn't it, in the UN context, the right to access information being critical.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so this is kind of underpinning what we're talking about here. Just before I move on to involving others again in this conversation, one thing I'd be interested to hear from you from, Thomas, is we're talking largely about media development and global media freedom in the context of what's required in the global south. How important is it for states in the developed West, liberal democracies, to actually ensure that they are leading by example when it comes to media freedom and freedom of expression?
I instinctively don't like the idea of leading by example, but I do think that around the world we see legislation being used in a copycat manner, and particularly in the United States and in the European Union, legislation or directives that are passed do tend to get replicated. But you can apply that in a regional context as well, where dominant countries tend to lead, not always the case, and that gets replicated as well. So I think all countries in the world, regardless of where they are geographically, need to pay particular attention to the implications internationally of the types of legislation that they pass, and to give really serious consideration, particularly in the digital context, of what those pieces of legislation look like and what they mean for individual expression.
Yeah, indeed, thank you. Gwen, can I come back to you? What about the role of international development donors? Many of them gathered here. What do you think they could most meaningfully do in Southern Africa at the moment? What are the most urgent challenges that they're addressing?
Well, I think, as I mentioned early, Julie, they have played a very important part in the past, and they will again in the present and the future in regard to sustaining good media. But the thing is, I think it needs to be emphasized that we really do need to listen to the voices on the ground, especially in the global south, whether it's Southern Africa or elsewhere, and look at the ways and means in which they can make sustainability a reality, but not losing sight of the importance of independent professional journalism lying at the heart of anything and everything we want to achieve. I've got some ideas around that, obviously, as I come from the background of that assistance from donors back in the 80s and setting up a trust, newspaper as a non-profit trust. And I think they need to look very specifically at tried, true and tested models out there to support them. Because I think a lot in the past, there were a lot of commercial advantages that certain unscrupulous elements took from creating so-called independent media. So I think the trust model is a good and accountable and transparent one. It's not a silver bullet to survive the sustainability challenge, but I think it holds a lot more potential. And if I may, Julie, I think part of that challenge is obviously maybe the biggest aspect of sustainability is really quality journalism. And I think it's got to be, well, it has to be helped that the journalists themselves must embrace the digital challenge. And in order to do that, they must innovate and they must help to create and strengthen independent media and radio on the ground in Africa in particular, to reach those communities where the internet has not yet penetrated. And again, the Reuters report shows us the huge gap between penetration in the US and the Americas and Europe and Africa and the global south, where it's much, much lower. So I think that's a challenge. And if I may, really there's a huge need for us not to forget and to go back to journalism quality and to go back to basics. You know, today an old school journalist myself hears a lot about the new journalism, the immersive journalism and all kinds of other journalism they're teaching you about. But I think what we really need to do, we cannot develop investigative depth that is going to gain credibility among audiences when many, many young journalists lack the fundamental understanding of why their role is so important in society and how it contributes to the larger cause of press freedom and democracy. So I think that's absolutely critical, and media literacy is vitally important as well.
Okay, great. Mira, from your overarching perspective, what are you seeing working? Where can we see evidence of impact when it comes to investment in media development programs, specifically linked to media freedom?
Well, as Gwen has mentioned, for some of the outlets and for different forms and shapes of journalist organizations, this assistance actually acts as a lifeline. And we know that at the moment, official development assistance in journalism and media is anywhere between 350 billion to 400 billion per year. And that is invested in different parts of the world, in different ways, shapes, and forms. And even though it doesn't seem like a large amount compared to that gap that I described previously, it's really important. And not only the amount of money is important, but the way this money is implemented, distributed, and reaches outlets that have all those needs, including addressing security concerns. You mentioned SDGs, and then how do we see what's working and what's not. At the moment, we have a high-level political forum in New York, where SDG 16, Sustainable Development Goal 16, is reported for the first time. And we've been looking into correlations between access to information, media sustainability, democracy indicators, but also development targets and indicators. And there is high correlation, and data shows it really clearly. There's high correlation between media sustainability, access to information for local communities, and, for instance, corruption. High correlation with election participation. High correlation with all the other democratic processes in which the citizens participate. So it's very important for us that governance assistance to the field of democracy, of development, recognizes this important role of media and journalism and integrates media and journalism in a meaningful way in this assistance. Just to go back why the structure and how this assistance is implemented is important. At the moment, assistance to media and journalism is highly fragmented. It's coordinated in very few places. Lessons learned are not funded. 70% of our members receive funding that's short cycle funding, and very few receive something that we would call capacity building and organizational support to survive throughout this period. And so the new challenge is that we don't support anymore just a non-profit organization and non-profit news. Now all kinds of journalist organizations are in
professional journalism.
Yes, professional journalism, and they are different types of organizations. And we need to recognize that they're maybe not the most skillful in fundraising, but their need is very, very big at the moment.
Great, thanks, Mira. Dickens, I'll come to you next. From the issues you've highlighted around digital transformation, how effective are current interventions in addressing that? What needs to be done to improve it?
I mean, just to, I think Gwen nailed it. I think the crisis we have at the moment, yes, there is we need to talk about the challenges in terms of the regulations that are being passed in different countries that are anti-media. There's also obviously the question about the business models, but equally as important, if not the most important thing, is trust. There was a survey that was published by Afrobarometer just a few months ago, and it was quite shocking actually that increasingly Africans are supportive of the government to control or to be in charge of, if not to review, what is broadcast and printed in newspapers. And my question is that, I mean, from the outside, you'll probably start analyzing that and saying, well, the governments are becoming repressive. But I think for me, the most important question is, what has the media done to the point where the public now feels that the government can just literally, basically they're inviting the government to the newsroom. So I think that's a really, really key thing. I think in terms of, support from development organizations, I think one of the key things, having been a benefit of some of the trainings. For example, I think one of the things that I can look back to is I remember, going for a week, 2-week training, and then back in the newsroom, and then you have literally zero support. You try to, if you want to
exactly. Yeah.
So I think what international media organizations probably do is that have long-term relationships.
Yes.
I've seen some of the media summit organizations are now working with universities. I think that's a very important thing.
Journalism education is
exactly.
part of the mix. Yeah.
And literally embedding, professionals and trainers in newsroom. I think that's the sort of long-term investment that brings the change. And in terms of, we're talking about, like for example, FOIA laws. Like in my country, Kenya, there's a freedom of information law, but I've not seen any media organization actually go out there to test it. So I think there's some knowledge transfer that can definitely help.
And support to actually access some of the laws to ensure that they are being
exactly.
enacted. Okay, Thomas, if I can come to you. Thinking about the issue of sustainability and the broader challenges of freedom of expression with the sort of wider interventions that we're seeing in that space. Can you talk to us about what you think is essentially required now? So with donors, I've just come back from Ethiopia where I'm doing a project in connection with DFID, and there are so many challenges, so many needs, but from a global perspective, what's your take on this?
Well, I'm going to highlight some of the points I think that have been made already. I think the key issue here is that although Mira pointed out that increasingly different types of actors, non-traditional media actors, are producing journalistic content and need to be supported in that sense, still the vast majority of media actors are commercial entities. And that makes media development a very different looking sector than other sectors. Even where we have in some countries public service media, those models are also now under intense pressure.
Genuinely public service media as distinct from state broadcasting.
As distinct from state broadcasting, exactly. So new models do need to be found. And I think there are kind of 4 key areas that governments who are putting resources into this need to think about and look at. The first one, obviously, I would say is regulation. I mentioned public advertising earlier. I think there needs to be more regulation around public advertising, but more broadly support to what converged regulation looks like and support to actors who are responsible for regulation of the media sector per se, and self-regulation where self-regulation applies. I think the financial foundations is a point that has been mentioned a few times. So obviously continued access to advertising markets, looking for opportunities to access digital advertising markets from the global north and the global south, but also different types of income generation through microfinancing and non-commercial models and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of ideas out there as well. I think we can't move away from the very important area around resilience of alliances and networks, so the media has to work together, has to push for these things and fight for these things from a national context to national stakeholders.
Collaboratively.
Exactly, collaboratively. And the last one, I think, is the point, Dickens, you were also making, which is that we need to think outside of the box, if I can use that term, around low-cost production models and looking at how to generate high-quality content that can be replicated easily and quickly, but maybe not with the enormous price tag that has traditionally been put against it.
Yeah, it's a really
and bring forth another generation who are unafraid as well as committed to the craft.
And who are innovative and creative in responding to these challenges, which is important to note.
That too.
That's all we've got time for part one of this conversation. I'm going to thank these guests and welcome the next set of speakers up to the stage to continue this important conversation around media development. Thank you very much, Gwen and Mira. To the stage, the next set of speakers, we have Minister Harriett Baldwin, who is Minister of State for Africa at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and Minister of State at the Department of International Development. I'm speaking to myself at the moment, but trust me, there are people coming to the stage. We have Johanna Sumuvari, who's the State Secretary to Finland's Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thanks very much. Have a seat. Nishant Lalwani, who leads global strategy for investing in independent media for Luminate. Thanks for being here. And Gwen Lister, who's been the director of the Oslo Governance Centre since 2015. Thanks very much for being with us here today, and especially for taking the time to listen to the, I think, important interventions of our first speakers. If I can start with you, Minister Baldwin, can you just outline for us how DFID is responding to these myriad and urgent challenges we've heard described?
Yes, thank you very much, Julie, and thank you also to the first panellists, because I think they did set the stage very well. And on behalf of the UK government, it is my great pleasure and honour to, alongside the government of Canada, to welcome all of you to this important conference today. And really, we wanted to shine a spotlight on this issue. And we're doing it in this building where, of course, millions of copies of the Daily Mail and the Evening Standard used to roll off the presses. And apparently the quality of the paper was made it particularly good for wrapping your fish and chips. And as an elected politician, I do often think when you get bad publicity, you think, well, it's going to be tomorrow's fish and chip paper. But actually, this building really does symbolise two incredibly important themes from this conference. First of all, the economic changes that have affected journalism, and that's going to be an important part of what we will be talking about. But also, as you've highlighted, Julie, the political challenges and the challenging environment in which journalists around the world work. And so, as you said at the beginning, I wear two hats. I'm a minister at the Foreign Office and at the Department for International Development. Obviously, at the Foreign Office, we've always supported things like BBC World Service, delivering now more languages than ever before. The Access Now, which is a campaign to keep the internet on in countries, which again has become a major theme. The Foreign Secretary has announced new media fellowships when he went to Addis Ababa in March and in May. And it's for us at the Department for International Development, wearing that hat, we see this as very much a development issue, because citizens who have access to good information are then able to make informed choices when it comes to democratic elections. And all the academic evidence shows that the more democratic societies tend to have better outcomes in terms of development for their citizens. And so it's in that context that I'm very pleased to be able to announce two pieces of funding today. So we're putting our money where our mouth is today, Julie. And I'm announcing today a £12 million fund for a new Protecting Media Freedom programme. And given the civil service love of acronyms, it's called PRIMED, which stands for Protecting Independent Media for Effective Development. And that is a programme that will enhance the resilience of the media in developing countries. It's going to start off with an initial focus in Bangladesh, in Sierra Leone and in Ethiopia, and I think will give us important information about how we make these models more sustainable in developing countries. And I'm also very pleased to be announcing a further £3 million programme to bring together international advocacy, media, legal and civil society organisations to support freedom of expression and freedom of the media in challenging contexts in the Middle East and in North Africa. And those two programmes announced today supplement the programme that the Secretary of State announced in March, a further £12 million programme, so taking in total £27 million worth of programming that we've added this year to our already extensive work in this area. And I do think it's that as a development issue, we do put this at the forefront of our development work.
It's encouraging to see investments that highlight not just media development as an isolated cause, but in parallel and integrated with media freedom goals.
Indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll come back to you for further comments and questions. Johanna, if I can come to you next. You talked to us about Finland's engagement with media development and media freedom issues and how that's adapting to these current challenges.
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you, thank the UK and Canadian governments for inviting us all here. I think this is exactly what Finland wants to do, to be part of these international and multilateral discussions on how to defend media freedom and how to provide support for journalists who struggle every day in different parts of the world. And this kind of international engagement is what we want to really foster in the future too. As for Finland, many of you probably know that Finland and other Nordic countries are actually ranking in international media freedom and press freedom rankings. I think the latest one was from the Reporters Without Borders, and Finland was on the second place, and I think 3 or 4 other Nordic countries toppled the top 10. Well, in the top 10 as well. But I wouldn't say that it's self-evident. It needs constant, deliberate decisions and work to foster and oversee how that freedom is actually gained and achieved. And if I would just shortly say a few things that I think that have been contributing to Finnish media freedom and media environment. First of all, the thing that was mentioned quite often in the first panel was the right to access to information. That is very crucial and vital principle in Finland. And the right to access to information from the authorities is guaranteed very heavily by the legislation in Finland. And also it also applies for the public documents or documents of the authorities. They are by assumption public with some strict restrictions to exceptions. And that principle, I think, is something that we have to defend all over the world. Secondly, we have very high level of source protection for journalists. And it can be broken only in trial, and as far as I know, it has never been breached in Finland. Source protection is very, very pivotal value in defending media freedom.
There are new digital challenges, though, aren't
Of course, yes.
Which override some of our historic protections.
Yes, especially and online and disinformation and so on. And then media and information literacy, I was very happy that it was mentioned actually in the first panel. Finland has embedded media literacy and information literacy in its national education policies, and it's also part of our national curriculum. And I think we have to start from the early years. We have to start to educate our children already when they are at earliest education to be able to hold authorities, media, and those in power accountable. Media literacy contributes on that. And then one other thing is that we want to contribute to development cooperation in this realm as well. So we want to see international and multilateral support for various media freedom initiatives, of which this campaign by the FCO is one, and to support work of the UN, UNESCO, and other multilateral platforms. That hopefully we can discuss more about that later today.
Indeed, and the coming day, in fact. Thank you, Johanna. Nishant, we can come to you. The role of foundations, the donors, obviously vitally important in this. How are you seeing that role adapt to these challenges, which seem to grow with every time we meet?
Yeah, in a phrase, I'm not seeing them adapt quickly enough. I really commend, and Luminate commends the efforts of DFID and the Finnish government, Canadian government, and the others who are stepping up here. And also, the other existing donors in the space, Hughes, Catherine, Knight, and so on. But if you look at the amount of philanthropic capital going to independent media, outside the US in particular, it's wildly insufficient.
Yeah.
And this isn't a problem of the future, it's a problem of that's very present now. The lack of support for independent media, the dying away of media organisations. I mean, just in the UK, in the last 14 years, we've lost 235 newspaper titles.
Amazing, isn't it?
Which is extraordinary. And that's the UK, which has revenue opportunities, a reasonably robust media ecosystem on the global scale. You think about what's happening in Myanmar, and Philippines, and Brazil, and other places. Those democracies are being distorted because of the lack of support. And we have a large portfolio of independent media organisations that we know well, that we speak to well about their challenges. 9 out of 10 cases, capital is what is holding them back from growing their impact. These are editorially independent, hard-hitting, investigative journalism and news outfits, press freedom outfits. So really, we're calling for philanthropies and other donors to increase their support, and we think there's kind of a couple of different ways in which they should do that. Firstly, they should support experimentation, the same way you were suggesting, Minister. So, there needs to be a new paradigm for media. That's going to take some time to develop. We're not going to get to solutions overnight, how media can be sustainable, but we have to start trying and experimenting. We support things like Milosevic, which is an incubator in Latin America that supports experimentation, the South Africa Media Innovation Program in South Africa, looking for new digital startups that can actually improve and rebuild the trust between individuals and media institutions. The second area which we think philanthropy especially should be stepping up in is the support, the legal support for journalists under threat. There's really only a couple of organisations that globally cover media attacks on journalists. One is the Press Freedom Defence Fund, the other is the Media Legal Defence Initiative. Both are here. Both are terrific organisations, but are really held back by the amount of funding that's available to them. And they have a terrific success rate. MLDI has about a 70% success rate. 90% of the journalists they've defended continue to report. Yeah, right. I mean, it works. Yeah. It really works, and yet there isn't enough support. There aren't enough dollars going into these organisations.
Especially when you're seeing a weaponisation of the law against journalists around the world.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to come to you now, Sarah, from your perspective. What's working and what's not working? How do we adapt?
Well, I think as the UN Development Programme, what we've seen is actually an increasing recognition of the issues that we've been talking about all morning as being absolutely central to sustainable development and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So you mentioned Goal 16 and Target 1610 related to peaceful, just and inclusive societies, but I think what we're seeing from our country offices and the UN country teams is actually the recognition that this is much broader than just these governance and political process questions, that we are not going to achieve sustainable development in any form unless we get this issue right. And so we are seeing really an upsurge of demand from our national counterparts, from governments in many places, from other stakeholders as well, for support in this area. And I think we're at a very interesting point, and we really welcome this initiative by UK and Canada because, as Nishant just said, there's wildly insufficient funds related to this, and yet we've suddenly, I think, globally there's an understanding that this is probably one of the issues of the day. So this initiative and others, I think, are attempting to bridge that sudden recognition, and I think that's really important. But I think one of the important things to bear in mind as we move forward with this is that it's really important that the outcomes of this conference and other initiatives, I think, are well integrated into the mechanisms and processes that are already in place in the countries in which we work. For example, yes, we shouldn't be setting up parallel processes, otherwise they will remain siloed discussions and limited impact. So I think we need to be thinking very carefully over the next couple of days about where are the spaces in different countries where this agenda can be well integrated into what is already going on in country. And those will also be the developments and the human rights spaces that already exist. So I think that's where our focus needs to be in this development discussion.
Is there room, do you think, for, say, a media freedom and media development indicator almost attached to every kind of intervention in development. So rather than being siloed as a set of kind of media development expectations and principles, like can we apply a media freedom and media development indicator to health programs, to road building, for example?
Well, part of the genius of Agenda 2030 and also the trouble of implementing it is that is the vision of Agenda 2030, that it is universal and universal, all countries, and indivisible. So built into the processes of Agenda 2030 is supposed to be that cross-cutting element. That is extremely difficult if you're an implementing agency to implement and then to monitor and measure. But we are looking, in other work I'm involved with, actually, we talk about Goal 16 as being the enabling goal for the whole agenda. And the High-Level Political Forum in New York this week and next is looking at some of these issues around how is Goal 16, including 1610, enabling the whole of the agenda. And there's various tools and mechanisms and analysis and so forth. So yes, absolutely. But I think there's already space in that, in the agenda as it's constructed for that to take place. And certainly from UNDP's perspective, we've been trying to bring these media discussions into that space. So Mira and GFMD and so on have all been very involved in this reporting process around Goal 16 that's taking place at the moment at the HLPA.
Okay, perhaps this is an opportunity for you, Minister Baldwin, to talk to us about practically how these kinds of goals might be. I mean, in the UK, for example, we have both DFID and the Foreign Office working in parallel on these issues, which is relatively unusual internationally. So integration is what you're working on currently, and you obviously wear two hats across those portfolios. So is there space within your context for media freedom and media development to really be brought into the core of all kinds of development work?
Well, I think that's what we've been grappling with as we designed the programme that we've announced today, is to take the context that Nishant articulated so clearly around some of the challenges to some of the models and embrace the opportunities for innovation. And we've had some great examples. BBC Africa Eye has done some incredible work around for example, some of the information that was being disseminated during the elections in Madagascar. And they also did a really good report on how Facebook was being used to stir up some of the violence between farmers and herders in Nigeria, for example. So I think there's incredible innovation going on. I think what we've tried to do in terms of these programs is to embed an ability for us to learn as a world community and internationally, so that one of the things I think we can all agree on is that there are some great individual examples, but we're much, much stronger when we form networks and institutions. And I think that yes, we're in and of ourselves an institution and a network, but what we're trying to do here is empower our other players to really strengthen the links between themselves, so that they can face some of these common challenges together, and we can learn from what works and inform development in other countries from what has worked in specific environments.
So collaboration.
Collaboration, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so Nishant, how do we go about improving, sorry to keep moving back and forth, it's like a long line of heads. How do we go about improving opportunities for collaboration and cooperation? There's a lot of effort, a lot of it, as you pointed out and others have pointed out, is disconnected. What needs to be done there?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And even though this is just the first panel, we're seeing a strong theme emerge, which is that this is a radically difficult problem to solve. And so, we think that there's a radically new solutions needed to deal with this, both in terms of financing and in terms of cooperation. And a number of us, Luminate, BBC Media Action, the Global Forum for Media Development, and others, have been working on a proposal for an international fund for public interest media. Now, this would be a large-scale international fund to provide core operating support in low and middle-income countries for public interest media. We estimate that we need a lot of new capital if we're really to make an impact on this problem. Right now, we have about $500 or $600 billion of both aid capital and philanthropic capital going into support media, that's not proved to be enough. And so we think that we need significantly more, around $1 billion a year, to go into supporting... Internationally supporting public interest media as we get through this crisis. The problems of business models...
I'm glad you see an end, potentially.
Yeah, I do see an end, but it's not going to be solved in 2 or 3 years, right? We have problems of business models, we have problems of mis and disinformation, and we have the increasing attacks, politically motivated attacks on journalists. We estimate it's going to take 10 to 20 years to really get to a new paradigm of media, where we can have democracy that's supported through a robust corporate state. And that's why we're calling for a discussion on this. We've commissioned a feasibility study, which we're really happy to share, and discuss how we can make this fund a reality.
It's a big gap between 500 million and 1 billion. Are you confident you can get there? Is there will? Do you sense that there is will?
We've had a lot of positive feedback on the idea and on the intent to support it. We believe that there's going to be 3 types of entities that could support this. First of all, it's government agencies who I think are recognizing the increasing impact that mis and disinformation especially are having on national security and democratic processes. Secondly, philanthropic actors, as I've explained. And thirdly, we've already started discussions with the large tech companies who have understood the impact that they've had on democratic ecosystems, on media, and we hope that they'll really step up and begin to address some of those challenges. Yeah.
Okay, so collaboration that goes beyond governments, that goes beyond your international organisations.
Right.
Some of them you've named, the International Centre for Journalists, and others around the world that have been working on these problems for decades.
And I should stress that this isn't just about financing,
yes,
but it should also be a hub for understanding what's actually working in media, for evaluating what's working.
Test and research and...
Yeah, and for having devolved decision-making in all of the countries that receive the money.
Yeah. So what you're talking about, sorry, I'll come to you now, if you like.
I was just going to say that we've earmarked some funding to support exactly these kinds of initiatives. Obviously, we would want to see exactly what it was that we will be paying for in the value for money case. But we certainly have, in addition to the money that I've announced today, set aside a further £4 million, up to £4 million to support this kind of work. And we look forward to hearing that compelling case that will allow us to unlock that.
Fabulous as you start, and hopefully that will be matched by other donor countries and you're on your way. Joanna, how important is this kind of collaboration that Minister Baldwin and others have highlighted, whether it's around funding or implementation, particularly between, say, foreign ministers and ministers responsible for development?
Yes, I think it's extremely important. I think we have had this goodwill for a long time, but I think the times we're living in, the current media landscape, just underlines that we have to act rather now than later. And I think it needs both. It needs vocal political commitment through all fields, fields of politics, media companies, journalism, and civil society. And I would like to strengthen. I would like to stress the importance of civil society and supporting also journalistic organizations. And especially, I was happy that tech companies were mentioned here because Finland wants to stress the importance to support vulnerable groups. For example, disabled journalists, female journalists who encounter a lot of online harassment, hate speech, and silencing. And those discussions are very vital that we can have free media where the freedom of expression is truly cherished. And I think for those we need both tangible measures, which means funding of course, and supporting institutions, but we also need vocal political stance which goes through multilateral field, international voice.
And this sometimes involves a willingness to be subjected to the same kind of scrutiny that you're requiring other states to be subjected to, doesn't it? So it can be a bit uncomfortable to put media freedom and media development squarely on the agenda for some states. So that, I think this is an important step, as an external observer for that reason. But I'm wondering also, though, about the competition that we sometimes see between, obviously there's competition between recipients of donations, there's competition between various organisations trying to act as umbrella organisations. How do we turn that, that competition into collaboration? Is there do you have any comments to make on the kind of attitudes or philosophies that need to be brought to the table for that?
Well, I think, personally, I think I agree with what was just said about how we need to also strengthen the platforms and institutions and tools we already have. And the UN is, for example, very good platform for this kind of collaboration. Finland is supporting press freedom initiatives and programs through UNESCO and on other fields as well, other multilateral forums. But I think we need also coordination as to that we are aware of what each organization is actually doing on this field, and then to use this kind of platforms what we are sharing now together to discuss those measures and find common way to act in a more effective way.
So cooperation, collaboration, coordination.
Yes, and of course we need also money. That's self-evident.
I think that's clear. Sarah, can I come to you? And perhaps from a UN perspective, I mean we've heard mention of UNESCO and the UN as an umbrella organisation. How do you think, based on what you've heard so far, these sorts of initiatives could actually have effect on the ground?
Well, I think we're hearing a lot of really promising things this morning and a lot about money, which is always good. But I think what's really important was actually stressed in the first panel as well by Gwen and by Nishant now, that we need to be co-creating the solutions and various different solutions. That there isn't a magic bullet, there isn't a template for what needs to be done on different issues in different contexts. We need to be co-creating across media organisation, governments, civil society, academia, and so forth. And if I could give you perhaps one practical example to bring the discussion a little bit down to ground, in Uruguay is having a number of elections coming up. I believe there may be 4 or 5 or even more. And UNDP, with the rest of the UN family, with UNESCO, has been facilitating the signing of a pact between all the political parties engaged in those elections around the issue of disinformation. And to help, because it was a concern to all those involved in the political process, the electoral management bodies and so forth. And that involved quite an extensive consultation program with the tech companies, with media, with the electoral bodies, with academia and the political establishment and so on. And there was actually a signed pact as a result of that, and a number of other initiatives, media and information literacy campaigns and so forth. And now we are also looking as the UN at how that model could be adopted in other places. What can the lessons learned be? Not that you export that, but that what did we learn and how can we share that with other countries going through similar situations? But all of this takes people. It takes political will, which is partly what we're talking about today. It takes money, it takes facilitation, and it takes a sort of country-specific view of what are the processes going on in that country or that subnational area, and how do we address those with the actors that are there already.
And another concrete example, I mentioned I've been in Ethiopia on a project funded by DFID. Twice, in fact, I was in Ethiopia in May for World Press Freedom Day and then for this project. And things have turned quite, taken an ugly turn since I left, where there was so much promise, so much hope, so much expectation and so much urgency around donor funding. And urgency is the question in a place like Ethiopia, where we have upcoming elections and so many challenges confronting, recently liberated and somewhat now curtailed media environment. That question of urgency, when we're talking about international donors, we're talking about international umbrella organisations, the UN, states, how do we address things quickly when crises emerge, and we've seen so many of them currently?
Well, some of that is why we've all gathered here to talk about we actually do have an urgent moment, but there is also also a need, I think, to take a longer view on some of these issues. Nishant said we're not going to solve these issues in 2, 3, 4 years. I think as somebody who's been working on governance issues for 25 years, we are at an extraordinary moment of change and none of us actually know how that is going to turn out. And if you take the example of Ethiopia, for example, I don't want to do a PR exercise for my own agency, but UNDP has been there for decades and will be there for decades. And there may be difficulties in a process now, but I think having that trusted relationship with stakeholders built up over decades is actually really important when there are shifts and ups and downs. And so it's equally important that I think all those who care about these issues don't all rush in with their own solutions when they say, this is the most urgent issue now in this country, and suddenly the world descends. Actually, we do need to take time to develop those relationships in country with many of the people who live there and are living these issues with their families, and take time to listen to what the solutions and the issues are there.
Great. I want to come to the floor for questions. We have about 10 minutes. It's very hard for me to see hands, so I'm actually going to rely on people with the microphones to pass those. I have lights in my face. I'll get you to keep your questions very brief, please, and comments as well. I think I can see the first question is going to be up the back. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and who specifically you would like to answer your question, please.
Well, my name is Suleiman Abrahima. I am the Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa. We are based in Ghana. In terms of what's working and what is not working, I think part of the problem is that even the 600 million or 500 million that we talk about as media support for the years, quite a bit of it has dramatically shifted from supporting media freedom or supporting media development to media for development support. So increasingly what we are seeing is support for media and environment, media and health, media and climate change, and so on, and media investigative reporting, anti-corruption reporting, and so on, and little support going into how do we support those who do the kind of journalism that we want them to do and get into trouble. And increasingly, for example, we are coming under a situation where it is a bit easier to get money to engage in anti-impunity campaigns after a journalist has been shot dead, than getting money to, for example, promote a safe haven program that is intended to keep these journalists alive. So I think the issue is to begin to look at how we perhaps do the two, media development and also media for development, as opposed to what we are seeing now, which is increasingly funding towards media for development. And just a quick one, in terms of support for media development, particularly in the digital age, we are also beginning to see a lot of interest in supporting digital startups, venture capitalists supporting innovative media hubs and so on. But quite a number of times, these are not media organizations that are into mainstream journalism. But so maybe entertainment outlets that is getting the traffic, they look so sustainable, and they get the support. So there is also dwindling support towards digital startups that are focused on doing real journalism, and therefore we don't get the traffic. Okay, excellent. Who do you want to answer that question? Is there a question, or you just wanted to be able to say that? Well, a contribution, but I would like to hear from, yes. Okay. Do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks, Lim. So I completely agree with you that there is a need for core operating support to go to the reporting organizations and media development organizations. It's long been Luminate's policy to offer just that. The vast majority of our support doesn't specify any editorial subset of an organization's mandate, and we believe that we have to do that because we have to back editors to know what's happening in their regions, in their countries, in their contexts, and decide what the most important things are to cover. That also links to the point around how we rebuild the trust between media institutions and readers, viewers, individuals who consume media. It's only the actual editorial teams who can and should be understanding what readers and audiences want from their media. And specifying that as a funder, I think, is against the principles of productive media support.
Okay, yep, question down the front here. I'm trusting the people with the microphones to determine whose hand was up first.
I'm Nishant Lalwani from Bangladesh. I'm very happy to see this happening and delighted it's being addressed. My concern is, despite all the nice things I'm hearing, the gap between the rhetoric and the practice.
Yeah.
I mean, walking up, we saw the Assange, the little resistances outside, but quite apart from that, in my country, I'm very aware of how Britain has supported the Rapid Action Battalion, which does most of the crossfires. I am, myself threatened by the fact that surveillance equipment and tools are sold by Germany to Bangladesh. And I come across this situation where governments who say so many nice things are perfectly happy to put up with client dictators when they respond to their agenda, when their needs are met. And human rights transgressions and all those sort of things are put under the carpet, a little tussed, but otherwise it's okay, and it's business as usual.
Do you have a question for perhaps one of our state representatives?
Well, perhaps for the Minister, yes.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much for all the work that you do. And I think that you perfectly illustrate our assessment, which is that it is important for us to be working, choosing Bangladesh as one of the contexts in which we work, but also that you highlight the need for voices like yours to be heard and for the kind of investigations that you do to be heard. I think as politicians, I always say to people that we respond to the things that we are told about, and it is so important for people like you to be highlighting these issues, and that's through either your journalism or through engagement with other politicians. This is how these things get highlighted and addressed, and why we think that as a development issue, free media is so important, because getting the facts out there for politicians to hear and then to try to respond to is the crucial developmental path on which it will take us as decision makers.
Where's the microphone next?
Thank you. My name is Evan Trace. I come from IREX. It's an American nonprofit that supports media development and media literacy globally. My question for anyone in the panel is, how do we resolve the tension as donors and implementers between supporting independent media survival and independent media sustainability? The issue has been broached a few times in both panels, but we find many times that the simple or the most direct model of supporting independent media is to give content grants or grants for operational costs. But we also find that those can impede development and progress in terms of the media outlet's ability to find a place on the market. So I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has thoughts on how to resolve that tension. Is it something that we kick down the road, or can we work on both things at the same time? Thank you.
Okay, they're pointing to you, Nishant.
Okay, first of all, terrific question. I think that's an excellent diagnosis of two of the challenges that we face. And I do think they are quite distinct challenges. So let's first of all agree that public interest media is a public good, and we have to have it. And if we don't have it, our democracies will fail. So we have to keep sustaining public interest media. And that might take public capital, and that might take philanthropic capital as we go through this turbulent time. We're flying a plane through a very turbulent time. We can't let the plane crash. That's why we're proposing this very large-scale fund to sustain and provide core operating support to public interest media. I think separately, we need incubators, innovative sort of stimulators of business models, right? Things like the Membership Puzzle Project, which is an organization that figures out how journalism can have deeply engaged relationships with its readers.
Through membership.
And through membership, and also therefore increase loyalty and increase revenue, ultimately. That's a very different operation from keeping the plane flying.
I would argue too, with my researcher hat on, that what you also need is evidence-based research to underpin these efforts and to enable the measurement of these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Minister Baldwin, you wanted to respond?
And we will try with our funding to strike that balance, which is not an easy balance to strike, but it's designed to both find those sustainable models so that they do become a sustainable way of providing that crucial content, but also we will, where there is market failure and there are poor and marginalised women in parts of Nigeria, for example, who just don't have a way to express their voice, we will enter and subsidise that otherwise a voice that would not be heard.
Okay, great. We have time for just one more question, wherever the microphone lands. Sorry, there are people up the front who've been waiting.
I'm from Nepal. As Julie said, I have also been in journalism for the last 30 years and now I teach in university. I'm particularly cast by the word global conference. And we are discussing the death of the journalist, democratic distortion of the regimes, or so on and so forth, which is sort of a presumption that there is some form of journalism. But when we talk about the term global, what about that at least 25% of the population of at least last 2-3 generations where for 7 decades never have seen any form of journalism? And those regimes now are very prominent economically and strategically. And our discussion of the media support, transparency, media laws, everything is being discussed. But I think that white spot, it may not be a single particular country, but that white spot doesn't seem to be figured out in probably any of the agenda. So how global perspective we are presenting, it may be the question to the minister.
I'm afraid
so
we
global?
We don't even have time for the Minister to answer unless you'd like to authorise an extension of his panel and say something.
Well, I think he's hit the nail on the head as to why we're holding this conference.
Yes.
And the statistic on the way in where it said that only 13% of the population of the world have access to a free media. I mean, that took me, startled me, and is why this conference is important.
Indeed, and that gives me an opportunity to wrap up and say that is indeed a very important note on which to end. We cannot forget those who either have never had access to independent, critical media of the kind we're talking about supporting in robust, meaningful ways, but also in a digital context, the vast swathes of populations internationally who do not have affordable or do not have the technology even to enable affordable access to the internet. I guess those are two things to bear in mind. Thank you very much to all of the speakers on both of these panels and to you for your interventions and for your patience. And please, I know there weren't many opportunities for questions in the context of this discussion, but seek us out over the course of the next 2 days and make your voice heard. Thank you very much.